There's a piece of paper in your wallet or a number on a banking app that carries more raw geopolitical power than any single weapon in any nation's arsenal. Not because of what it's made of, because of a specific, deliberate deal struck decades ago, one that turned an ordinary national currency into something every country on Earth would be forced to hold, whether they trusted the country printing it or not. Here's the claim this video is going to make, and it's worth being precise about it immediately. When we call the dollar a weapon, we're not talking about anything happening in the news this year. We're talking about a mechanism built between 1944 and 1974, 3 decades of deliberate financial architecture that quietly gave the United States a form of leverage no army has ever been able to buy outright. This isn't a story about tanks or missiles or troop deployments. It's a story about paperwork, treaties, and a single quiet agreement that most people alive today have never heard of, despite living inside its consequences every single day, every time they fill a gas tank or watch a news segment about international sanctions. Understanding how that mechanism actually works tells you more about real geopolitical power than almost any headline you'll read this week. This is the story of the Petro-Dollar and the secret deal that built it. To understand how the dollar became this powerful, you have to start at the end of the most destructive war in human history, in the summer of 1944, at a resort hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. Delegates from 44 allied nations gathered at Bretton Woods with an enormous problem to solve. The global financial system that had existed before the war had effectively collapsed, and whatever replaced it would need to prevent the kind of competitive currency devaluations and trade breakdowns that many economists believed had helped drag the world into economic depression and, eventually, war in the first place. The conference ran for 3 weeks of intense negotiation, and it produced 2 lasting institutions still in operation today: the International Monetary Fund and what would become the World Bank, both designed to help stabilize currencies and finance post-war reconstruction. But the more consequential outcome of the conference was the decision about which currency would actually anchor this new system. The United States arrived at this negotiation in an extraordinary position. Its industrial base sat entirely untouched by the bombing campaigns that had devastated Europe and much of Asia. Its economy had grown substantially during the war years, supplying arms and materiel to allied nations across multiple continents. And critically, the U.S. held the largest gold reserve any single nation had ever assembled. A substantial share of it accumulated because other countries had spent years paying for American weapons, ships, and supplies in the one currency everyone still trusted without hesitation. Rather than proposing some entirely new global currency, which the British delegation, led by the economist John Maynard Keynes, had actually favored in the form of a proposed international unit called the Bancor, American negotiators made a different offer, backed by the sheer scale of American economic leverage at the table. Let the U.S. dollar become the anchor of the entire post-war monetary system, they argued. Every other nation's currency would be pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate, and the dollar itself would remain directly convertible into gold at $35 per ounce, available to any foreign government that wanted to redeem it. It was, in substance, America asking the rest of the exhausted rebuilding world to trust its promise, backed by gold sitting in vaults at Fort Knox and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The other nations, facing few better alternatives and desperate for a stable framework to rebuild global trade, agreed. The Bretton Woods system was born, and the U.S. dollar became, almost overnight, the reserve currency of the entire planet, the foundational unit that international trade and central bank reserves would be built around for the following quarter century. This arrangement did something quietly enormous, well beyond simply stabilizing post-war exchange rates. It made holding dollars, rather than gold directly, the practical foundation of international finance for every government on Earth, embedding the dollar into the plumbing of global commerce so deeply that unwinding it would eventually become almost unthinkable. In the immediate post-war years, this produced what economists at the time called a dollar shortage. European and Asian economies, desperate to rebuild and import American machinery and goods, found themselves constantly short of the dollars needed to pay for it, a scarcity the United States helped address through the Marshall Plan and other Reconstruction financing that further entrenched the dollar's role at the center of the entire system. For nearly 3 decades, this arrangement worked reasonably well, allowing global trade to expand dramatically as nations rebuilt from the devastation of the war, using a currency whose value everyone could trust precisely because it was, at least on paper, still tied to a fixed and finite quantity of gold sitting in American vaults. It's worth pausing on just how deliberate this outcome actually was, because it's easy in hindsight to treat the dollar's dominance as some kind of natural, almost gravitational outcome of American size and wealth. It wasn't inevitable in that sense at all. Other arrangements were seriously proposed and seriously debated at Bretton Woods, and the delegates in that room understood perfectly well that whichever currency anchored the system would carry enormous, lasting advantages for the country issuing it, advantages that would persist long after the immediate post-war Reconstruction period had ended. The American negotiating team, led by Treasury official Harry Dexter White, pursued the dollar's central role with clear-eyed awareness of exactly what was at stake, and won that negotiation decisively against the alternative Keynes had proposed. What emerged from those 3 weeks in New Hampshire wasn't simply a technical fix for post-war currency stability. It was the deliberate construction of a financial order with a single nation sitting at its center, a design choice whose consequences would still be unfolding in ways nobody at that 1944 conference could have fully anticipated more than 80 years later. The system itself worked through a mechanism economists call a gold exchange standard, distinct from the classical gold standard that had governed international finance before the war. Rather than every currency being directly convertible into gold, only the US dollar carried that direct convertibility at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other participating currency was instead pegged to the dollar itself at fixed exchange rates that could only be adjusted under specific, internationally supervised circumstances. This meant, in practice, that the entire system rested on a single point of confidence. As long as the rest of the world believed the United States would honor its promise to redeem dollars for gold on demand, the whole structure held together smoothly. That single point of dependency, elegant in its simplicity during the system's early years, would eventually become the exact vulnerability that brought the arrangement down. But a structural problem was quietly building underneath the surface of this arrangement, one baked into the deal from the very beginning and largely invisible until it wasn't. As the American economy expanded through the 1950s and 1960s, fueling European Reconstruction, an expensive and increasingly costly war in Vietnam, and a growing domestic social welfare state, the United States kept printing and distributing more dollars into the global economy than its actual physical gold reserves could realistically back at the promised $35 rate. Economists at the time, most notably the Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin, identified the structural contradiction at the heart of this arrangement, a problem that came to be known as the Triffin dilemma. For the dollar to function as the world's reserve currency, the United States needed to run persistent trade deficits, sending dollars out into the world for other countries to hold. But the more dollars accumulated abroad relative to America's finite gold reserves, the less credible the promise of gold convertibility became. It was a system with a built-in expiration date, and by the late 1960s, that expiration date was approaching quickly. A group of central banks, including the United States, attempted to manage the growing pressure through a coordinated arrangement called the London Gold Pool, selling gold into the market to hold its price steady, but the pool collapsed in 1968 under the sheer weight of demand it was trying to suppress. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, was considerably less interested in extending diplomatic courtesy to this arrangement than most of America's other allies. De Gaulle reportedly viewed the dollar's privileged position with open suspicion, describing the arrangement in terms that questioned why the United States alone should enjoy what amounted to an ability to settle its foreign debts simply by printing more of its own currency. By the late 1960s, the French government had begun systematically redeeming its dollar reserves for physical American gold, reportedly, at one point, sending a naval vessel across the Atlantic specifically to collect it, a pointed demonstration of exactly how seriously other governments were beginning to scrutinize the gap between American promises and American gold reserves. Other countries, watching France's move, quietly began doing the same, and the pressure on America's gold stockpile intensified rapidly through the early 1970s, with foreign-held dollar claims eventually vastly exceeding the value of gold the United States actually held in reserve, a mismatch that made the eventual break simply a matter of timing rather than a genuine question of if. By August 1971, that pressure had become unsustainable. President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced what historians now call the Nixon shock. The United States was suspending the dollar's convertibility into gold entirely, effective immediately, with no announced plan to ever restore it. An initial attempt to patch the system followed later that year, an agreement negotiated at the Smithsonian Institution that devalued the dollar against gold and other currencies while attempting to preserve some version of fixed exchange rates, but that patch itself collapsed within about a year, and by 1973, the world's major currencies had shifted to floating freely against one another, determined by markets rather than fixed government agreements for the first time in the post-war era. The message to the rest of the world, in substance, was blunt. The physical backing you were relying on no longer fully exists, but please continue using the dollar as though nothing had changed. The rest of the world, by this point, had considerably less choice in the matter than the phrasing might suggest. The global economy had become so thoroughly built around the dollar over the preceding quarter century that unwinding it wasn't a realistic option for anyone, and the world, largely out of necessity rather than enthusiasm, kept using it anyway. This is the moment worth sitting with, because it's the pivot point the rest of this story depends on entirely. For the first time in modern history, the world's dominant reserve currency was operating on pure fiat value, backed by nothing except collective trust in the American government and economy, with no physical commodity anchoring it for anyone, anywhere. That should have been the moment the dollar's global dominance became genuinely vulnerable, since the one concrete promise underpinning it, convertibility into gold, had just been unilaterally withdrawn. Economists and financial commentators at the time genuinely debated whether the dollar could retain its central role at all under these new unanchored conditions, and some prominent voices predicted a serious and lasting decline in American monetary influence as a direct consequence of severing the gold link. Instead, within just 3 years, an entirely different mechanism would emerge to replace gold as the dollar's practical anchor, one built not on a metal sitting in a vault, but on the one commodity every industrialized economy on Earth had become absolutely dependent on: oil. The specific event that set this next chapter in motion, and the facts here deserve to be stated with the same precision any serious historical account should apply, unfolded in October 1973. On October 6, 1973, a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated military attack against Israel on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, aiming to reclaim territory Israel had held since the 1967 Six-Day War. The conflict, which came to be known as the Yom Kippur War, lasted roughly 3 weeks before a ceasefire took hold, with the United States providing significant military resupply to Israel during the fighting, an airlift of equipment and munitions that proved decisive in helping Israeli forces stabilize the front after early setbacks in the opening days of the conflict. In direct response to that American support, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, a subset of OPEC's broader Arab membership, announced an oil embargo on October 17, 1973, halting exports specifically to the United States and several other nations perceived as supporting Israel during the conflict, while simultaneously cutting overall production by a scheduled monthly percentage to further tighten global supply regardless of destination, a production cut that affected even nations not directly targeted by the embargo itself. The economic shock that followed was immediate and severe. Oil prices, which had remained relatively stable for decades under the previous arrangement of major Western oil companies effectively setting global prices, roughly quadrupled within a matter of months, rising from around $3 a barrel before the embargo to nearly $12 a barrel by early 1974. Gas stations across the United States faced long lines, rationing measures, and in some regions, restrictions limiting purchases to alternating days based on license plate numbers. Industrial economies throughout Western Europe and Japan, almost entirely dependent on imported Middle Eastern oil for their post-war manufacturing growth, experienced severe inflation and economic disruption that persisted for years afterward, contributing to a broader period of stagflation, the previously unusual combination of high inflation and stagnant economic growth that would define much of the remaining 1970s across the industrialized world and reshape economic policy debates for a generation. The embargo itself was formally lifted in March 1974, following diplomatic negotiations led in part by then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, but the underlying lesson it delivered to Washington was impossible to ignore. Oil-producing nations, several of them significantly smaller and militarily weaker than the United States, had just demonstrated they could inflict genuine, sustained economic damage on the world's most powerful economies simply by coordinating their export policy. For American policymakers, still absorbing the consequences of severing the dollar from gold just 2 years earlier, this represented an urgent and specific problem, one discussed at length in internal U.S. government deliberations throughout late 1973 and into 1974. The dollar had lost its physical anchor in 1971. Now the nations controlling the world's most strategically vital commodity had just proven their willingness to weaponize access to it, in the most literal sense of that word, cutting off supply as a tool of geopolitical pressure. Something needed to replace gold as the mechanism binding the world to the dollar, and it needed to be built quickly before the 1973 crisis repeated itself, or the dollar's position eroded further under the combined weight of the gold shock and the oil shock arriving within 2 years of each other. The broader economic damage from the embargo lingered for years after the immediate crisis ended. Unemployment in the United States climbed alongside inflation, an unusual and deeply unsettling combination for economists trained on the assumption that the two typically moved in opposite directions. Automobile manufacturers, whose post-war business models had been built around larger, less fuel-efficient vehicles, found themselves rapidly outcompeted by smaller, more efficient imports, reshaping the American auto industry for a generation. And perhaps most importantly for the story this video is telling, the entire episode fundamentally altered how Washington thought about energy security, elevating oil from a straightforward commercial commodity to a matter of first-order national strategic concern, a shift in thinking that directly shaped the urgency behind the negotiations that would follow with Saudi Arabia over the following months. The solution American officials arrived at was remarkably direct, even if the negotiations behind it were conducted with considerable discretion at the time and remained only partially public for decades afterward. Beginning in 1974, U.S. officials, working through direct diplomatic channels with the Saudi Arabian government, established an arrangement that would come to define the international monetary system for the following half-century. The terms, as they emerged and were later confirmed through historical accounts and declassified records, were straightforward. Saudi Arabia would price and sell its oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars, regardless of which country was purchasing it, and would invest a substantial portion of its resulting oil revenue, managed through the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency, back into U.S. Treasury securities and American financial markets. In exchange, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military equipment, training through an American military mission stationed in the kingdom, and an implicit security guarantee, protecting Saudi stability in a region that had already proven, through the 1973 crisis, how quickly conflict could destabilize the entire global oil supply. A formal U.S.-Saudi Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, established the same year, provided the institutional framework through which technical assistance, arms sales, and financial cooperation between the two governments would flow for decades afterward. This arrangement is what historians and economists now refer to as the petrodollar system, and its significance extends far beyond the specific terms of one bilateral agreement between two governments. Saudi Arabia, at the time and for decades afterward, functioned as the world's dominant oil producer and the acknowledged leader of OPEC, the cartel of oil exporting nations that had just demonstrated its collective leverage during the embargo. Once Saudi Arabia committed to pricing its oil exclusively in dollars, the practical incentive for other OPEC members to do anything differently collapsed almost immediately. Pricing oil in a currency other than the one the world's largest exporter used would have introduced needless complexity, exchange rate risk, and reduced liquidity into every transaction, for no meaningful benefit. Within a relatively short period, the overwhelming majority of global oil trade, regardless of which producing or consuming nation was actually involved in a given transaction, came to be denominated in U.S. dollars as a matter of basic market convenience rather than explicit coordination, a convention that other major Gulf oil producers, including Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates, adopted in practice without needing a separate formal treaty of their own, simply because trading in any other currency would have meant swimming against a current every other major exporter had already committed to. Here is the mechanism worth understanding clearly, because it's the actual engine behind everything the title of this video is describing. Oil is not a luxury commodity that some countries can simply choose to forego. It is the foundational input for transportation, electricity generation, plastics, fertilizer, and a substantial share of everyday manufacturing in essentially every economy on Earth. Once the overwhelming majority of that oil could only be purchased in dollars, every country that needed oil, which is to say, functionally every country on the planet, was forced to first acquire and hold U.S. dollars simply to participate in ordinary economic life. This created a permanent, structural, and largely involuntary global demand for the dollar that had nothing to do with whether any individual government actually trusted or admired the United States. A government could be openly hostile to American foreign policy and would still need dollars to import the fuel keeping its economy running. That single structural fact, more than gold ever did, is what has anchored the dollar's global dominance for the past half-century, and it's precisely what allows the dollar to function as leverage independent of military force. Any nation significantly cut off from the dollar-denominated financial system risks losing practical access to the oil, and by extension, the economic function that system was built to provide. It's worth being honest about the limits of what's publicly documented here, since this is a genuinely useful moment to distinguish established historical record from more speculative popular retellings. Some later accounts of the 1974 arrangement have circulated more dramatic or more precisely quantified versions of the deal than official records fully substantiate, and serious historians of the period generally treat the exact private conversations between American and Saudi officials as still only partially disclosed, pieced together from declassified memoranda, subsequent testimony, and the observable pattern of what actually followed rather than a single signed and fully public treaty document. What is not disputed, and what matters most for understanding the mechanism itself, is the observable outcome. Saudi oil was priced in dollars. Saudi oil revenue flowed substantially into American financial markets, and the U.S.-Saudi security relationship deepened considerably in the years immediately following 1974, a pattern of behavior consistent with the arrangement as historians have generally reconstructed it. That structural dependency created a second mechanism, almost as consequential as the first, one that compounds the dollar's leverage rather than simply sustaining it, what economists call petrodollar recycling. Oil exporting nations accumulate enormous quantities of dollars through export revenue, far more than their own domestic economies can productively absorb through ordinary spending and investment. Rather than holding that wealth as idle cash, these nations overwhelmingly reinvest it directly back into dollar-denominated assets, U.S. government bonds, American equities, U.S. real estate, and stakes in American corporations. Investment banks throughout the 1970s and beyond built entire specialized divisions specifically to help manage and channel this flow of Gulf oil wealth into Western financial markets, and the sheer scale of it helped deepen and expand what became known as the euro-dollar market, the vast pool of dollar-denominated deposits and lending that operates outside the United States itself, largely centered in London, yet still fundamentally dependent on the American currency and, ultimately, American financial regulation. This creates a closed, self-reinforcing loop that has operated for decades largely out of public view. Oil-importing nations purchase oil using dollars, sending those dollars to oil-exporting nations. Those oil exporters then invest a substantial share of that revenue directly back into U.S. financial markets, effectively lending the money back to the American economy that originally issued it. That reinvestment helps fund U.S. government borrowing at lower interest rates than would otherwise be available, subsidizes American capital markets with enormous inflows of foreign capital, and completes a cycle that keeps the dollar's value and centrality reinforced continuously, transaction after transaction, decade after decade, regardless of shifts in which specific administration happens to occupy the White House at any given moment. This is where the weapon framing in this video's title becomes something more concrete than a rhetorical flourish, and it's worth explaining precisely and historically, rather than gesturing vaguely at current events. Because such an overwhelming share of global trade and international finance more broadly is conducted in dollars and processed through the American banking system at some point in the transaction chain, often through the SWIFT international messaging network that coordinates cross-border bank transfers, the United States government holds a genuinely unusual form of leverage, the ability to restrict a foreign government, bank, or company's access to the dollar-based financial system itself, a tool that has been used across multiple decades and multiple administrations of both American political parties in the form of financial sanctions targeting everything from drug trafficking networks to state sponsors of terrorism to specific sanctioned regimes. A nation significantly cut off from dollar-denominated banking doesn't simply lose access to American goods. It risks losing practical access to the oil markets, international trade financing, and cross-border banking infrastructure that the entire global economy runs through, because so much of that infrastructure, regardless of which two countries are actually transacting, passes through dollar clearing systems at some point along the way. This capability didn't exist in anything like this form before the petrodollar system made dollar holding structurally mandatory for virtually every economy on Earth. Prior to 1974, a nation could, in principle, largely insulate itself from American financial pressure by conducting its trade in other currencies or through barter arrangements. After 1974, doing so became progressively more difficult with each passing year, as oil and eventually a growing share of global trade more broadly became denominated in the one currency the American government could, in theory, restrict access to at will. It's a form of coercive economic leverage built entirely on financial architecture rather than military hardware. And it is, in the most literal and historically grounded sense, the mechanism this video's title is describing. A currency that functions as a weapon, not because of what backs it, but because of what happens to any nation that loses access to it. This form of leverage has been exercised, in varying degrees, across administrations spanning both major American political parties over the past several decades, applied against a wide range of targets for a wide range of stated reasons, from counter-narcotics enforcement to non-proliferation efforts to responses to specific international incidents. The consistent thread across these varied historical applications isn't which party held the White House at the time, or which specific country was targeted in a given instance. It's the underlying structural capability itself, a tool that exists and has existed, largely unchanged in its basic mechanics, since the petrodollar system made near-universal dollar dependence a permanent feature of the global economy, rather than a temporary post-war condition. That durability, more than any single application of the tool, is what makes it worth understanding on its own terms, separate from whatever specific dispute happens to be occupying headlines in any given year. If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely. This is exactly the kind of story I built this channel to tell. Not the 5-minute headline version, but the slower one, where you actually trace how a piece of paper currency became one of the most consequential instruments of global power ever constructed. If that's what you're after, consider subscribing and joining us. We do this every single day. All right, back to it. Because there's a question worth sitting with, given everything we've just traced across 3 decades of deliberate financial architecture. Does this system hold indefinitely, or is it already eroding? The honest answer is that it's shifting, gradually rather than dramatically, and the shift has been building for years rather than emerging suddenly. Several nations, including Russia and China, have taken deliberate steps to reduce their reliance on dollar-denominated oil trade over the past decade, settling a growing share of their bilateral energy transactions in their own currencies rather than dollars. China has increasingly promoted yuan-denominated oil contracts through its own commodity exchanges, encouraging trading partners to settle transactions outside the dollar system where politically or economically convenient. The BRICS coalition of major emerging economies, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with several newer members added in recent years, has explicitly discussed reducing collective dependence on the dollar as one of its stated long-term goals, including preliminary conversations about expanded local currency trade settlement and, more speculatively, some kind of shared reserve asset or payment mechanism among member states. These shifts are real, documented, and worth taking seriously as a genuine long-term trend rather than dismissing outright as empty rhetoric. But it's equally worth being precise about the scale of that shift so far. Moving away from a financial system this deeply embedded in global trade isn't simply a matter of governments announcing a preference for a different currency. It means unwinding decades of contracts, hedging arrangements, and pricing conventions built specifically around dollar liquidity, all while few, if any, alternative currencies currently offer the same combination of deep, liquid markets, broad convertibility, and internationally trusted legal protections that the dollar still provides. The Chinese yuan, for instance, remains subject to capital controls that limit how freely it can move across borders. a structural feature that makes it considerably less attractive as a full reserve currency replacement regardless of China's economic size. Even nations actively working to reduce their dollar exposure for specific strategic reasons continue to rely on the dollar for the majority of their other international transactions, a pattern several economists have described as selective de-dollarization rather than wholesale replacement. As of this recording, the dollar remains the dominant currency in global oil trade and international reserves by a substantial margin, even as that margin has narrowed gradually over the past several years of accumulated pressure from multiple directions at once. And that gradual erosion, rather than a dramatic collapse, is exactly the kind of slow-moving geopolitical story this channel exists to trace. There's a specific irony worth noting here, given everything this video has just covered. The same commodity gold was displaced by in 1974, when oil took over as the dollar's practical anchor, has itself been quietly making a comeback in recent years, as central banks in exactly the nations most interested in reducing dollar dependence have significantly increased their gold purchases and reserves. It's a pattern that echoes, in reverse, the very shift this video has spent the last several minutes explaining. Nations searching for a store of value and a medium of exchange that doesn't ultimately answer to any single government's decisions. The same underlying motivation that made oil for dollars so attractive to Washington 50 years ago, now working in the opposite direction against the system that motivation originally built. Because the next chapter of this same underlying competition isn't happening through oil contracts at all. It's happening through an entirely different commodity, one with no need for any government's trust whatsoever. The same commodity this channel has already covered in detail, and the one central banks around the world have been quietly stockpiling again in recent years for exactly the reason you'd expect. Here's what stays with me about this story, long after the treaty details and the historical dates fade into the background. The dollar's power was never really about the paper or the ink, or even the size of the American economy printing it. It was about a specific, deliberate sequence of decisions made across 3 decades by people who understood something most casual observers of global finance still miss: that whoever controls the currency the rest of the world is structurally required to use holds a form of leverage that operates continuously, silently, in the background of nearly every transaction on Earth, without ever needing to fire a shot or deploy a single soldier. Bretton Woods gave the dollar its initial global platform, built on the trust that came from gold sitting in American vaults. The Nixon shock nearly took that platform away entirely, severing the one physical promise the whole system had been built on, and for a brief moment in the early 1970s, it genuinely wasn't obvious what would hold the system together next. And the Petro-Dollar arrangement, negotiated quietly in 1974, in the aftermath of a crisis that could have permanently weakened American economic power, rebuilt that platform on an even more durable foundation. Not a finite quantity of gold sitting in a vault, but the universal, non-negotiable need every modern economy has for oil. That's the part of this story worth carrying forward. Currency, at this scale, isn't just a medium of exchange. It can be architecture, deliberately engineered, load-bearing, and largely invisible to the people whose daily lives depend on it functioning correctly, the way almost nobody thinks about the plumbing behind their walls until the day it fails. What makes this particular piece of architecture so durable is that it doesn't rely on any single administration, any single treaty renewal, or any single act of ongoing diplomacy to keep functioning. It runs on the accumulated momentum of 50 years of contracts, habits, and institutional inertia, each individual transaction reinforcing the pattern a little further, the way a river carves its channel deeper simply by continuing to flow along the same path it already found. Nations rise and fall, alliances shift, and the specific instruments of global power change from one century to the next. But the underlying instinct this story reveals, the recognition that controlling the plumbing of global exchange is worth more than controlling any single battlefield, is one that outlasts any particular currency, any particular commodity, and any particular decade in which it happens to be tested. There's a version of this story that ends with a warning about American decline and a version that ends with reassurance about American permanence, and this video has deliberately tried to avoid landing firmly on either. What the historical record actually supports is narrower and, in its own way, more useful than either dramatic framing. A specific institutional arrangement, built deliberately across 3 decades by identifiable people making identifiable decisions, has persisted for 50 years longer than many contemporaries expected it to, precisely because it was built on a structural necessity, oil rather than a fragile promise, gold. Whether the next 50 years look the same is a genuinely open question, and one this channel will keep returning to as the evidence accumulates, rather than one any single video can responsibly answer today. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and share it with 5 people who'd actually sit through something like this. Leave a comment. Tell me honestly what you thought, and tell me what instrument of hidden power you want us to trace next. Because somewhere in the world right now, another quiet financial arrangement is being built that most people won't understand the significance of for another 50 years.